Please.
Thank you very much. The conference is about migration, borders, and identity, and I don't think we've spent much time on identity. And I want to talk about identity, and particularly about national identity. In circles such as these, national identity smells bad. We think Orban, we think Kurz, we think Salvini, we think of what we call populists. It's all the malaise of nationalism, and nationalism is only 1 centimeter away from fascism. So we don't walk comfortably with the concept of national identity. And what I want to do first is to make the moral case for identity and national identity. Then I want to explain why it still has such a tremendous appeal in the lives of so many people, because although I have no patience and no like for the likes of Orban and Marine Le Pen and Salvini and Kurz, but there are millions and millions of Europeans, it's not a marginal phenomenon, who are following them, and I simply refuse to characterize all of these as fascists or idiots. And I also don't like the word populist. If we like it, they popular. If we don't like it, they populists. So I want to try and understand where this is coming from. So the second will be why the continued appeal of national identity. And then I will, in a very European context, how we have mishandled the question so that we've opened the gates for the likes of the Orbans, etc. So whence the actual value, not from a social science point of view, appeal, but from a moral philosophy point of view, the value of identity and national identity. So there's a religious version, there's an equally compelling secular one, but the religious one is actually very easy to explain. So all of us, men and women, were created in the image of God. And being created in the image of God leads us to the most essential value that we value in liberal democracies, in our liberal societies, which is human dignity. In practically every constitution, the first fundamental right is human dignity is inviolable. Kvod Adam v'cheruto. The United States is the exception that puts liberty as number one. And in what consists that human dignity that comes from the creation in the image of God? So there are two sides to this coin as I see it. One is that all of us, rich and poor, tall and short, fat and thin, etc., share an equal worth. We cannot say of anybody that he is worth more in an essential sense than somebody else, because we are all created in the image of God. And into our language, even into our secular language, creep in religious imagery, the sanctity of life, and that everybody has to be treated, even in the most extreme circumstances, remembering that it is a creature created in the image of God. So there's this equal worth of everybody. But the other side of that coin is that each one of us is unique in the whole of human history, whether it's 10,000 or 100,000 years. Nobody has ever lived which is exactly like Mark Lila. He is in many ways totally special. And nobody will ever live which is exactly like Mark Lila. So each of us has a uniqueness which is essentially us. And to treat us as fungible, you're no different from anybody else, and not recognizing that uniqueness is equally an assault on our human dignity as to say that somebody is worth more than somebody else. And if that is true for the individual subject, that deep value rooted in dignity of our uniqueness, it is also true for our collective identities. So there might be something, and it's valid and valuable, called sovereign equality, but I'm Italian, and in some ways I'm not French. And it's okay for me to celebrate my unique identity as Italian. My history, my language, my food, my dress, my literature, my poetry, my music, and everything that goes with that, without disrespecting the other. But don't please try and take from me that kind of uniqueness and allow me not only to celebrate it, but to cultivate it, to preserve it. So national identity in this case, in this sense, in my view, is rooted in a deep moral justification. Why is it so appealing? I want to postulate something. I want to postulate that every human being is in deep existential quest for giving meaning to our short life. So it's not only about existing and putting food on the table and prospering, etc., but also we want to be able to say that our lives have meant something. And usually for our lives to mean something, it has to be that it means something more than just my self-interest, that I have contributed something that transcends my specific self-interest. So I'm postulating that. I'm saying it explains a lot of human behavior. Now, national identity appeals to that. National identity appeals to that. It doesn't speak much to, I think, what you call the elites or academics, etc., because we think the books we write give meaning to our life, they will survive us, etc. It's self-deception, but we all know it's a very narcissistic profession. But think about national identity. It's, first of all, inclusive. It's rich and poor, it's old and young. It's everybody who belongs to the nation belongs to the nation. It transcends tribes, etc. And secondly, it's very, very rich, because as I mentioned, there is literature, and there's culinary tradition, and there's history, and there's poetry, and there's music. There's a huge cultural asset that goes with that. Now, history is important, because I might die, but my nation won't die, and that gives meaning to my existence. And I might not be the one who wrote the Nobel Prize-winning book, but I'm part of a cultural asset, which is the cultural asset of my national identity. And that also gives meaning to my life. And I have a history, because I have a collective history, which is part of my national history. So in the quest, in that existential quest of giving meaning to our life, there can be other vehicles. But we can see that national identity maintains its appeal because it corresponds to that thing. And that, therefore, I agree with many of the things that Mark Weiler said, but also with one of the comments. It's silly to think that the crisis we have now in, I'll speak about Europe again, the Euroscepticism, the challenges to the liberal democratic state, it's all about economics. It's all connected to Gini factors and unequal distribution of the deserts of globalization. It has to do with that, but that's not the only thing. People are not only economic agents, and their dignity, their self-understanding, their existence is driven by other factors as well. And this national identity that I was talking about is part of that story. Why is there a crisis? And now I'm specifically European, so I know most people here are either Israelis or American. Careful with the parallels. Careful with the parallels. So for decades since the Second World War, for example, the word patriotism was anathema in Europe. Nobody could declare themselves to be a patriot. The only place you could wave a flag was at a football match. And we understand why, and it is understandable. Because patriotism was associated with fascism, with Mussolini, with Hitler, with Franco, etc. It was a bad word. But it was one form of patriotism, the fascist patriotism, where the individual belongs to the state. Not the glorious patriotism which comes from the Republican democratic tradition, where the state belongs to the individual. And the individual has a stake in the state, etc. But that whole vocabulary of patriotism, the only one that was allowed was constitutional patriotism, a la Habermas. But we note about constitutional patriotism, there's no difference between the Italian, the French, the Spanish, or the Lithuanian constitutional patriot. They all believe in the same set of values which are encapsulated in the European Convention on Human Rights. There's very little margin in the ideological profile of the constitutional patriot. So it doesn't respond to that need to feel unique and special and celebrates one national identity, etc. And then here I would have put in a whole thing, but Mark spoke about it. Democratic structures in Europe just do not respond to that. Why was in Brexit the most potent slogan taking back control? And I regret Brexit deeply as a European. Europe without Great Britain is a very different Europe. But taking back control resonated, and it resonates not only in Britain. Brexit is just an extreme example of that, because there really has been a loss of control, and there continues to be a deep democratic deficit in the governance of the European Union. So people have a feel that they don't control. Now, you know, when you're told to drive 80 kilometers an hour, you drive 95 before the police stop you. We were told to speak 12 minutes, but everybody except one spoke 14 to 15 minutes. So I'm going to steal, with your permission, you know, those 10 kilometers an hour on the motorway. In Europe, we've thrown away the baby with the bathwater, because instead of the debate being what kind of national identity, does the immigrant really threaten our national identity? Can we take pride in, for example, what Angela Merkel did, etc.? How do we want to understand the relationship between the nation state and a state of all its citizens? Is there contradiction to say that Italy is the state of the Italians, but in Italy there are groups of people who share a different culture, etc., and are equal Italian citizens to whom the state belongs in exactly the same way it relates to ethnic Italians, etc.? How do we think of nations like the United Kingdom, which is a nation of nations, or Spain is a nation of nations, although they don't want to acknowledge it, etc.? Instead of that being the center of the debate about who we are, we just buried it because we can't speak about nationalism. Because to say national identity is almost, in Spanish you would say a palabrota, a bad word. It's a kind of F word. So we just left that field open to the likes of Orban, to the likes of Kurz, to the likes of Salvini, who come in with one version of national identity, which is proto-fascist, which is atavistic, and is not necessarily the only one, but the alternatives are just not part of our political discourse. Thank you.